Hello and welcome to this episode in Introduction to Psychology. We're taking on Chapter 6, which is learning. And the focus of this particular chapter is not going to be on all aspects of learning. We're going to deal with cognition, intelligence, and creativity in another chapter. What we're going to focus on in this particular chapter is two main areas of behavioral oriented learning process. First, we're going to look at classical conditioning, and then we're going to look at operant conditioning. Now, within this as well is going to be some description of the special assignment, which is a personal change project in which we apply what we know about operant conditioning to make a personal change in our own behavior. For right now, I want you to take a look at this image. We'll be coming back to this. Again, you'll see that image again, and I'll do a little explaining as to why I exposed you to that. When we're looking at learning, we're looking at the concepts of things that are learned and things that are unlearned. This is essentially the same question when we ask nature versus nurture. So learned would be nurture and unlearned would be nature. Now, many of the early theories of psychology presented us as blank slates upon which experience wrote and determined who we were going to be. However, we know that that's not always the case. There's many instances in which we are born and we have the capacity to do something, we have a built-in mechanism waiting to be filled with particular information, even cultural information such as language. So we don't come in as a blank slate, but certainly there's a lot of blanks to be filled in, so we can look at it that way. So as an infant, we come in, we have some instincts. There's genetic predispositions that we have, things that have to do with our evolution, and of course the process of socialization. Now let me point out two things in here. I mentioned instincts, but in truth, the Chapter 6 quiz is asking you as to whether or not individuals, human beings, have instincts or not. Now instincts can be defined as a pattern of behavior that is precise and exact, and every member of that species enacts in the same behavior. Birds flying south, the echolocation of dolphins, the types of nests that birds make regardless of the materials. In fact, an ornithologist, a person who studies birds, can look at the nest alone and tell you most likely what kind of bird made it. That's how instinctual that behavior is. So we have to maybe take a look at human behavior, and does anything in human behavior meet that criteria? And basically the quiz is asking you to address that question. So if we look at these other characteristics, we have genetic, which is the limits and abilities that we have built into our nervous system and our bodies, special particular aspects of our behavior that have been passed on within that genetic component through evolution, and of course the huge amount of information that we get from being socialized. Now, socialization in this particular instance refers to the sociological term, which is the passing on of information in the culture from one generation to the next in order to maximize that individual's survival. Now, we're talking here about learned and unlearned. These terms, however, can be replaced by conditioned and unconditioned. They are the same thing. So as we move forward and we're looking at this first theory, classical conditioning, and we're looking at the word conditioning, and we'll look at conditioned and unconditioned examples and whatnot. You can say learned as well. Unlearned and learned, same thing. You can use those interchangeably. So make a connection with what you already understand about things that we've learned and things that are not learned and built in. Use that to understand the words when we use them in the theory of classical conditioning. So that will be the first one that we look at, is classical conditioning. Now, classical conditioning actually constitutes a majority of what we know. It is learning by association. You might think that the alphabet letters, the shapes of the letters themselves, that an A is shaped like that, we've learned to associate that set of lines with a particular sound, maybe even that one even associates with good grades, right? A's, not only beginning of the word apple, but it's also a hierarchy of grades. So that symbol of the A has become very meaningful. And so we learned that by the constant association of the image, the sound, the shape, and meaning that was portrayed to us during socializations. Let's say when we were first learning the alphabet, we might have been looking at a book and there's the A and we traced it out. Maybe it was on felt, so it felt different, and we could do that. And then there's an apple there and the A sound, maybe the big one and then the lowercase, all of that, these continual processes of associating what we're looking at with what we're hearing and feeling about particular notions in our world. Lots of that through the process of classical conditioning. It's very experiential, all the things that we experience, in addition to operant conditioning, which we'll talk about later. We'll see that there's certainly a lot of experiences with that as well. It's adaptive and evolutionary, and there are many, many, many applications of this to classical conditioning. Like I said, learning the alphabet, memorizing things, what do they call those? When you flip the cards. You see like a word and the definitions on the other side. That is a process, that is classical conditioning. It's actually, interestingly, it's operant conditioning as well, because you get a reward every time you get it right. Flashcards, that's it. Educational psychologist, you'd think I'd have that right off. Now, probably, however, and what I like to do in this class is to focus the application on something that we experience every day, and that is the notion of advertising. You might now wonder why I showed you that picture right at the beginning. Now, classical conditioning itself was discovered and sort of coined by Ivan Pavlov. He lived in St. Petersburg in Russia, and his study of classical conditioning is probably one of the most famous and cited studies in Introduction to Psychology. However, what we talk about in Introduction to Psychology is not what he actually did. He did all kinds of different experiments. He didn't always use a bell. In fact, I don't think he ever used a bell per se, and you'll understand what I'm saying in just a minute. It wasn't straightforward, but we use pieces of what he actually did in explaining how classical conditioning works. So let's take a look at the classic experiment that he conducted with dogs. Now, Ivan was a pretty big fan of dogs. He used dogs. He was a physiologist, and he was interested in the gastroenterological processes of digesting food in dogs. He had surgically implanted a tube that would collect saliva, and he was experimenting on different stimuli that would produce different amounts of saliva in the dogs. Now, something occurred, the legend has it, that an assistant or him was going out into the other room to get the food for the day, and the dog started salivating. And being the observing scientist that he is, he's, what's going on with that? Now, we have hindsight now, and of course, the dog, they're hearing the stuff get ready. They know what's coming. Well, how do they know what's coming? Was that ever taught? Did we ever bring them over and, hey, Fido, this is where we get the food? If you have cats, you see this all the time. But how did they learn it? So Ivan wanted to figure out how this actually works. So he conducted a number of experiments, all of which together are best represented by this particular graphic. So here we have, across the top, is the existing condition prior to learning. So we have the before conditioning. These two things are facts. If we took food and we put them in front of a dog, they would salivate. If we rang a bell, there would be no salivation, but the dog would notice it. Now let's look at the words conditioned here. No one taught Fido to salivate when the chicken arrived. That was unlearned. So, in the terms of stimulus response, the unconditioned response is in response to the unconditioned stimulus. The state of affairs right now for Fido is that in the presence of chicken, he will salivate. We also know that the neutral stimulus doesn't produce salivation. It does, however, catch the attention of the dog. Fido hears it, and he's aware of that other stimulus. When we go into teaching mode, what we're doing is we are combining both the bell and the chicken. Now, for a while, the chicken's there, so there's some salivation going on, but every time there's a chicken, there's also a bell. And then you can probably guess, after a while, the dog starts to associate just the bell with salivation. Now, it's important to recognize that at the end, once learning has happened, just the bell, no smell of chicken, nothing, just the bell produces the salivation. And that's how the dogs learned that those sounds were associated with getting food. Now he made this into an experiment. He had lights, he has buzzers, he had all kinds of sounds, he had different kinds of food. He was just extremely thorough, complex analysis of this process that gives us this sort of automated associated learning. Now, we call it classical conditioning because we came up with another one. So just like we have new Coke and classic Coke, we didn't have classic Coke till we had a new one, right? So it's not like he came up with the name classical conditioning. He was just telling the learning in animals, it was a non-logical thinking. They didn't have to say, the dog wasn't necessarily thinking, oh, the assistant's now opening the cupboard that we have our food in, therefore I'm going to wait, I'm going to get some food pretty soon. He's saying that is not there, that the actual learning was at a very surface level, sound associated with this, so there the response happens. Advertising operates on the same principle. Now, before we go to that, I have to tell you a sad story, and that is the fate of Pavlov's dogs. I always try and include this in here because I'm a little bit of a World War II buff. And the fact is, yes, he lived in St. Petersburg. But prior to World War II, St. Petersburg was renamed Stalingrad after Stalin. Now, if you do a little bit of history on World War II, you know that there was the Battle of Stalingrad, and that's when the Germans surrounded the city of Stalingrad in Russia and attempted to starve them all. And they're extremely successful at that. That ended up being a complete disaster for both the people of Stalingrad, but in particular for the German Reich, and it was the beginning of the end of the World War II. Now, sadly, while the siege was happening and no supplies were being enabled to come into Stalingrad, this is long after Pavlov himself has passed away, but his experiments were continuing, and the people of Stalingrad actually broke into his lab and ended up consuming all of his dogs. It was a desperate time. And so I say it a little facetiously, but sad for the dogs, but that is, part of the reality of this history in our psychology. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you remember the ad that I gave you right at the beginning of this slideshow? Well, here's that ad again. Now, this is an ad for Coors Light. It came out of a Sports Illustrated magazine, and understanding the way in which ads work is an exercise in classical conditioning. So I'm going to dissect this particular ad. We're going to look at all the different pieces of it, and we're going to use the same terms that we used when we were talking about Pavlov's dogs. Now, first off, we have an unconditioned stimulus. That is an unlearned stimulus. Now, in advertising, the unconditioned stimulus is almost always the quote-unquote mysterious, funny, or attractive image. So in this particular instance, we can say that these two girls' picture and the text, here's the twins again, is the unconditioned stimulus. Because it's a stimulus that's unlearned, it's producing an emotional response. That's key. This picture produces an emotional response. That response is unconditioned. So this is the current state of affairs. Certain people will talk about who this is targeted for, but certain people will see this picture and they'll have an emotional response. They're attracted, or elevates their hormone levels, whatever it is, that's the point. Now, meanwhile, on the same image, paired together just like the bell and the chicken, we have the neutral stimulus, the product. The neutral stimulus is almost always the product, with the exception of branding. When we have a brand, sometimes the product itself or the logo is the actual stimulus-inducing thing. It's already been learned. In fact, we could call successful brands like Apple or the swoosh from Nike or any one of those logos can actually, at this point, by and large, once you reach a certain age, are pretty much unconditioned responses. They've been conditioned already. So those logos alone are sometimes the attractive component. And that's the difference. It's kind of a goal of many products, is to become a brand so that the brand itself is recognized and elicits that emotional response. But until then, we have to pair them here. The neutral stimulus is the product. Now, unlike the experiment, this is put out there and the learning does or does not happen. If the learning happens, if the individual looking at this image, the totality of the image that includes the unconditioned stimulus, which produces the unconditioned emotional response, in the presence of the neutral stimulus, an association happens, then the nature of the product changes. It changes its color here. Now, the product itself has its own properties to produce an emotional response. The product now becomes a conditioned stimulus, so it changes from neutral, it loses its neutrality now that we've associated these together, and it becomes a conditioned stimulus, and it produces the same emotional response. That response is now categorized a conditioned response, even though it's the same as the one above. Now, this is what product makers want. They want you to have a little tinge of the same feeling you had when you saw those girls associated with their product. They want the product itself, a can of beer, to produce a little bit of the emotion that you had with that particular picture. Now, here's where we get into some of the research that's going on about this. Who's the target audience here? Now, the target audience can be discerned by looking at the picture and by looking at where it was published. Now, this is, of course, research that's done by the advertising company, who employs psychologists to do this all the time. So who reads Sports Illustrated? Mostly men. Women do too, but mostly men, mostly young to middle-aged men. So if you're going to pick a picture to associate with your ad, you want to make it attracted to young and middle-aged men, hence the two girls in the picture. Now, so that picture, we understand, well, what emotional responses, separate from everything, what emotional responses would that elicit? Of course, you're looking at the age of sexual maturity and all that stuff, so sex sells. We get this notion that if I put beautiful images, or what I think are going to be beautiful images, to my target audience and associate them with products, I may associate those feelings that they have about those images to the product, and product sales will go up. And doesn't it sound silly? Doesn't it sound really silly that we would think that somehow I would get the same feeling out of the beer that I would at actually meeting these two young ladies? Of course it sounds silly, but it works. The association learning works very, very well. It is wide across all kinds of different aspects of advertising. Now, just to be fair, let's bring in this guy right here. Now, this picture, of course, is a little bit different, but essentially, sex sells. Now, we can look at each aspect of this. The unconditioned stimulus is the black and white romantic picture that we see. The unconditioned response would be however people might think and feel about this particular image. The neutral stimulus is the Chanel. Once the Chanel is learned to be associated with the same emotional response as Brad, then it becomes a conditioned stimulus with the conditioned response. Now, what's the target audience here? Now I'm going to tell you it's probably women, might be men too, but the product is women's cologne and the ad is in Vogue magazine, which has much more women readership than men. Now we can have an argument about who would be attracted to these kinds of things, but then we see ad placement and it becomes even more direct. Lots of research going into advertising and where we actually see them. It gives us an idea of the target audience. But even if you didn't know where this came from, you would probably make the assumption that they're at least trying to get the attention of women who might know of and maybe have had ideas about Brad, and it gets associated with a cologne that they can buy, and then maybe they'll get a little Brad in their head the next time they see a bottle of Chanel. Now, here's the thing. We have taken some of these. I'm going to give you a little shock here. An ad that came out in a magazine several years ago. It didn't last long, but it was certainly controversial. And that is Burger King came out with this. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of you can understand the implications of this particular ad. The text on it, the copy, as they say, it'll blow your mind away. BK's Super 7-incher. The sexual innuendo is all over this ad. It was extremely successful, extremely popular, and it came up with people making complaints. And my understanding is that the model herself was brought in to do that picture and was not aware of what she was going to be paired with. She didn't know that that was going to be the result of the ad, and she actually successfully sued the ad company for damages to her career because she became herself. I mean, just see, like, wow, this was just such. I was going to say mind-blowing, but we'll just avoid all that. It was such an intense ad. And I would even further say that you look at the text on the bottom here. I'm not sure if you can view that, but it says, "Fill your desire for something long, juicy, and flame-grilled with the new BK Super 7-incher. Yearn for more after you taste the mind-blowing burger that comes with a single beef patty topped with American cheese, crispy onions, and the A1 thick and hearty steak sauce." It just goes on and on. And it works. Now, other ads, like Apple's Think Different ads that came out with to portray great thinkers of the world, certainly on a different vein. But here we have branding. Now, Burger King's a brand too, there's no doubt. Apple's little apple, it once was rainbow colored, and it is now just a white apple, is probably one of the most successful branding adventures in advertising, and they've had all kinds of different ones, including the Think Different ads. Now, other successfully branded things are like, Anheuser-Busch's, Budweiser commercials, and whatnot. Particularly the ones over the last few decades here of they had frogs, they had Spud McKenzie, They have the Clydesdales and the little puppy, and they have storylines going from one ad to the next. I mean, this is quite an amazing thing. I am a football fan. I don't know any of the players or anything. I just like watching the game because I find it an exciting game, and I do look forward to the Super Bowl. But not only for the game, the ads that they do, that's a special time. There's actually awards that are put out for the ads that come out on Super Bowl. So there's another competition going on. Now, just like we looked at each one of these ads, I'm going to have you do the same thing with another ad. So here's the assignment. This is Chapter 6 assignment. And here's the ad. You know, the ad in the course book doesn't have all this stuff all over it, but I want you to identify the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response. I have target audience in there, but certainly the neutral stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, the new status of that neutral stimulus, and the conditioned response, which would be the same as the unconditioned response. I want you to be able to write that up in the Chapter 6 assignment. At this point, we move from classical conditioning to operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning grew out of the research in behaviorism almost as a reaction to, it came out right around the same time that Freud was coming out with his psychodynamic theory, and these two theories were diametrically opposed to one another. The scientific viewpoint of behaviorism was that we should only be dealing with the things that we can directly observe, and things, intrapsychic sort of energies like were being discussed by Freud, which we'll discuss in personality, are just not the place for psychology to be. So along came behaviorism, and then later on in that world came B.F. Skinner, probably the most famous of all the individuals in behaviorism. And his theories have been translated into the theory of operant conditioning. And I'm going to tell you something about operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, of all the theories that we talk about in psychology, of all the different interventions that we talk about in psychology, this is the one that is the most effective at achieving the goals of psychology to describe, explain, predict, and control human and animal behavior. Those four goals are very, very well established and achieved within this model. It's not the only one. Certainly it's not the way that we always think about the world, but these are very, very powerful mechanisms and very powerful theories that we use all the time. Now I'm going to introduce to you what is called the ABC contingency theory. Very easy to remember. You learned these letters a long time ago. The ABC stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. It's called operant conditioning because the antecedents and the consequences operate on the behavior. They have an influence on the behavior. So what's happening before the setup for the behavior and the consequences for the behavior determine how and when the behavior is going to actually occur. So I developed a chart to kind of like explain these three things here. And we have, so when we're developing a plan and applying this, we might write out antecedents, behaviors, and consequences using a chart similar to this. Antecedents include instructions as to when and where the behavior, and that might include things like each time, every week, daily, when assigned, in accordance with the assignment. All of these things basically telling the individual when and where the behavior is going to happen. They may be symbols and signals in our society. We see a stoplight, and when we see that, that is the antecedent for stopping your car, right? And if you stop your car, there's consequences for that. Well, first I avoid some, I don't get a ticket and I don't get an accident, and I have time to switch the music on my iPhone and go to other music. So great things when you stop at the stop sign. Now the behavior part comes in here when we're doing behavior management, when we're doing operant conditioning. We need to very, very specifically describe the behaviors that we're talking about. We'll be getting to that in just a second here. Look at the consequences. There are positive reinforcers, negative reinforcers, all kinds of punishment. We're going to get into some detail about that. But for right now, I want to take a look at these two right here, the dead man test and the stranger test. Let's talk about this. When we are preparing a behavioral description to use in a behavior plan, it is vital that we describe that behavior in very, very precise scientific terms. Has to be measurable, observable, has to be an active activity. And the way to do that is you write out the behavior as you see fit, and then you expose that description to two tests. The first test I'll talk about is the dead man's test. And that is, can a dead man do that? Now, this is a clever play on words, but what it does is it eliminates the not behaviors. The not behaviors don't belong in behavior planning. So we don't want to have a behavior plan that says Billy will not trip his brother, because in the vernacular of behavior management, it actually creates a behavioral vacuum. You see, prior to the behavior planning, every time Billy saw his brother, he would trip him, and the reward was he got to show power over his brother, or his friends laughed, or whatever. There was a reward system. That's the descriptive aspect to it. If we say you can't do that, okay, and we take that option away, it creates a vacuum in which the older brother has to fill it with something. The antecedent is still there. Now I can't trip, so I'm going to hit him, or I'm going to push him down, but I'm not going to trip him. And you see where the not behaviors are all things that we don't want to have in a behavior plan, because we don't want to leave it up to the perpetrator to pick what they're going to do. We're going to tell them what they want them to do instead. And I'll stick with that particular example. The other reason the dead man's test is useful is it helps us identify when we can't really know what the person is doing. Let's say the behavior was they'll read silently at their desks. Now, we all know how to act like we're doing that. We have a page, we're looking down, we might even move our heads a little bit, and you might be thinking right now that I'm reading something, but I'm not. I'm looking at the keyboard, looking at blank space, nothing. I can make it look like I'm reading. And you could actually prop up a dead person and, put the book in the right place and stuff like that. And for all intents and purposes, it looks like they're reading, but they're not. Or we don't know that they are. So, the dead man's test, you look at your behavior description, if there's any knots in it, or there's anything like, that, no, I could prop up a dead man to do that. It's kind of a funny thing to think about, and you can see a lot of these behavior descriptions going away because they do not pass the dead man test. The second one is the stranger test. A little bit easier to conceptualize, and that is anybody coming into the room not knowing this person is going to know exactly what you're talking about. Okay? Let's say I'm going to have an exercise plan. What if I just write exercise plan? Now, there's a time to do that, and I'll get into that, but what if I just wrote exercise plan? Mark will exercise. Every day, the A, Mark will exercise. Well, a stranger comes in and says, what's exercise to Mark? It might be walking up and down the stairs, or it might be training for the Ironman. I don't know. Not enough description in there. And if we're going to hold ourselves and others to put these plans in place, we need to be very, very precise as to what they are. The only incidents you might use exercise or something simple like that is like see attached. And then you have a sheet. You might say exercise plan, and then you have a sheet where you're tracking that. I'm going to use that exercise plan, and on the other sheet, rather than in the actual document of the behavior plan, is the detailed part of what that is. So, when you're defining the behavior within a behavior management plan, you have the A part of the statement that says this is when it's going to happen, like every week. Mark will have an exercise plan, see attached, and that will have to pass both the dead man test, meaning a dead man can't do it, and the stranger test, meaning it's so clear a stranger could walk in. Now you also want to know, sometimes there's a behavior that's in the A, and we have to be clear about those. Like say there's a child that's exhibiting, tantrums. We might say in the tantrum, that might be in the A, is like during a tantrum. Again, we're going to have to define what that is, even though that's the A, and we're going to be asking them to do another behavior should they find themselves in a tantrum, those kinds of things. Eventually, we actually want to identify the feeling that came right before the tantrum, and that the inside self-monitoring process will be the A. When you feel like you're going to have a tantrum, do this instead. Now, we get back to our little chart here, and we're looking over here at consequences. The thing about operant conditioning is what happens after you do the behavior. What are the consequences? We deal with this all the time. What are the consequences of our behavior? And that should either encourage the behavior to happen or discourage the behavior to happen based on the results. Put my hand on a hot stove and it burns me. I hope that's enough to not put hands on hot stove. I don't know if when I learned that, I'm sure, I purposefully at some point, or my mom put it on a warm, sometimes parents will put their child's hand on the warm stove and then react, it's hot, just to drive in that idea, no matter what it looks like, don't put your hand on the stove. It's not the place where you put hands. And so, if anything, it's only happened by mistake. So certainly, there's that negative response, that bad thing happening, I burn my hand and experience pain, reduces the likelihood of me putting my hand on other stoves. There is, however, a complex sort of mechanism for the different kinds of consequences, all of which produce different kinds of results. So let's take a look at those. So getting into some detail here we have inoperant conditioning in terms of the consequences. This is just the C's. This is what we see. We can have reinforcements. Now, reinforcements, we have to understand, these are defining words. They're not particular kinds of stimuli. Like we might think praise, money, feel good, any one of those would be rewards. You would think that those are all reinforcers, but it kind of depends. In the science, we don't call something a reward or a punishment until we know its effect on behavior. So it's almost self-defining. We call it a reinforcer because we already have evidence that it increases or stabilizes behavior. Call it a punishment because it decreases or eliminates behavior. So it's always because of the results. So whenever we create a behavior plan, we're creating a little experiment. So you might have the A, and then we have the B defined in a way that meets the stranger and dead man's test. And then we're going to try a C. We're going to try a reward system or a punishment system, and we're going to see if it works. If it doesn't work, that means that that stimulus is not a reinforcer, or it's not a punishment, or they have other sources of that reinforcement, or you're not aware of reinforcers that are battling the actual punishments. All of these things, that kind of doesn't mean that behavior management doesn't work. It means that those stimuli that you're providing at the end don't have the power to operate on the behavior. Take some experimenting to get around to that. So here we're starting with the whole category of reinforcements, and we can see on the other side that they increase and maintain behavior, and then over here we have punishments that decrease or eliminate behaviors. Now, on the second tier down here, we're going to take a look at this one first. We're seeing the terms positive and negative. You think of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment. Really? Negative? You'd think punishment's always negative or something like that. These terms, positive, negative, I want you to think about them as mathematical terms, not emotional response terms. Positive is you're adding something. Negative is you're taking something away. So there are ways to add reinforcers, and there are ways to take things away that increase behavior. So therefore, the taking away of that thing increases the behavior. So it's categorized as a reinforcer. And the same on the punishment side. So if we look at some examples here, we have positive reinforcer. Here's, we give a treat when the dog sits, right after that, there's an example there. On the negative reinforcement, this is often kind of an interesting dialogue to have. Remember, we're still talking about reinforcers. Those are things in a category that will go away provided we do a certain behavior. Now think about, you're in prison. If you get good behavior, you get to get out of prison. So the behavior is, whatever they define as good behavior, and the getting out, escaping from prison is, getting out of it is the reward. So something's being taken away. Your jail present, the jail as part of your life is being taken away. An even easier one to think about that's a negative reinforcer is your alarm clock. No alarm clocks are designed to gently wake you up. None that I've ever heard of, at least. They have this annoying sound, and as soon as I engage in get out of bed behavior and reach over and press the stop button, as soon as that happens, as soon as I engage in that behavior, the annoying sound goes away. This is awesome. Okay, that's why if people are having trouble with the snooze button, they often say take the alarm clock and put it across the room. So you actually have to get out of bed and walk across the room to turn it off instead of just reaching over. And that the snooze button is actually sort of a temporary relief, and you don't have to do much to get it. It's sort of cheating. So those would be examples of escape and avoidance behavior. Now, in the avoiding place, let's say, and this is going to be somewhat complex, procrastination. Now, what happens in procrastination is complex, but if we're going to look at the behavioral component on it, is the fear of getting a bad grade. The fear of failure is a primary motivator for individuals to not turn in work. Now, what happens in terms of the mechanism of reinforcers, you didn't get a grade. You got a 0 on it. But when you don't hand it in, the psychology behind that is I remove the fear of getting a bad grade, which I might be more interested in doing that than actually trying to achieve a good grade. Because while I've removed the fear of getting a bad grade, I can rationalize in the notion of procrastination. I can rationalize, well, I got a bad grade because I didn't do it. I didn't get a bad grade because I'm poor at doing these things, or I didn't study enough or something. I can absolve myself of any of the responsibility for failing because I simply didn't try. And that for some people can become easier to deal with than the potential of trying and finding out that you didn't do well, even though you tried your best. So it's that compete, and you can see where that lays within this process. I'm avoiding doing something, and that feeling of failure or potential failure goes away. Very powerful forces for any of you that have a behavioral component of procrastination. This is fixable. This is fixable once you understand that sort of the logic of the illogicness of procrastination. It says, wait a minute, I'm so scared of failing that I'm not even trying. Well, maybe I need to get my head wrapped around it being okay to fail, and kind of talk to somebody about that. And I don't have to be perfect, and I can, and maybe that will help in some of the behaviors that you do. There's other things. I have a whole class I do on procrastination, pointing out the different things that you can do to decrease procrastination. But now we talked about reinforcement. Let's talk about punishment. Less often, we use punishment less often because it's actually better. It's better to reward a behavior than to try and punish to get rid of a behavior first, because when you punish to get rid of a behavior, you're left with a behavioral vacuum. So you'd rather define what you're going to do. If you're going to talk about an older brother hitting his brother, when I want to stimulate, I'm bored, I'm going to go hit my brother and then I'm going to laugh, the entertainment, kind of thing. What you can do is you can reinforce other behaviors that would make it impossible for him to hit. So rather than punishing him every time he hits his brother, it'd be better to replace that behavior with something else. Like every time you're bored and you feel like hitting your brother, I want you to come to me. Instead of hitting your brother, I want you to come to me, tell me that you're bored, and I will find an activity for us to do together or something like that. Or go to your room and play your favorite video game, or go outside, or what. It could be, do these instead of hitting your brother, and you'll get this reward. So the person comes into that, when we're looking at replacing bad behaviors by reinforcing alternative behaviors, the kid has a chance to make a decision. Do I hit my brother to get the stimulation from that, whether I get away with it or not? I get the stimulation of getting not bored because I just hit my brother. Or I pick this other one and I get not bored, but I also get a reward. Maybe I'll get an allowance or something like, well, that's a double whammy. If I choose this way, if I choose this path, I'll get both relief from my boredom and I'll get additional rewards for doing that. So that might be enough to push that person over to the more, pro-social type behavior. When we have punishments, these decrease behavior where we can add things. This is, spanking, obnoxious words, a good talking to, all of these things. And then, of course, when we remove a reinforcer, now they have on here sending a child to his room for cursing. This is actually not a good example of negative punishment. That's called isolation, and it's not effective. It's not very effective. It's better. Negative punishment is used when you're taking something away. Okay? We have another phrase for this that I know you've heard. It's called time out. But we often think of time out as sending somebody someplace. You have time out. Time out is technically time away from something reinforcing. And we've done this. Our child acts out. There was an incident in raising my kids where there was when my daughter was getting into this sort of like cyber bullying thing. And so for a month, we took away her cell phone. She's still alive. She didn't die because it took away her cell phone, but it took away that reinforcement. Said you've abused it, made it directly related to her behavior. It could be indirectly. There could be a punishment mechanism, like let's say you had a combined plan of, the kid that's beating on his little brother, you could tell I'm processing my childhood through this. So the big brother has a plan with mom that says, you have a choice between you can beat your brother and get in trouble, or you can do these other things and get rewards. So if you're going to have two plans running at the same time, you could have a positive reinforcement plan for every time you choose to do something else besides hit your brother. When you're bored, you're going to get, a token that you can use to change for, I'll get you a video game for every 10 tokens that you have. Then you can have another part of the plan that says, if you keep choosing to hit your brother, you're going to lose a whole day access to your game system. Every time you do that, you're going to lose a day. Both things can be going on. But in that combined plan, we're not only eliminating the behavior, we're giving the person choices as to what they can do instead. Now, that brings us to the behavior management planning assignment inside of this class. And that is your personal change special assignment. Now, in this particular assignment, I'm asking you to come up with an antecedent, come up with a behavior that you want to change, something you'll add in your behavior, something you want to do more of. Maybe you want to exercise more, or eat better, or treat persons differently, or spend more time with your kids, and all of those things. And you want to put yourself on a behavior plan to better yourself. The thing to understand is if that behavior right now is not occurring, then the behavior itself is not reinforcing enough. That's a little spooky. Now I'm gonna admit something to you. I don't enjoy long periods of time with little children. I know I'm a psychologist. I'm supposed to love kids, and I do love kids. I have a granddaughter. I love spending time with her. I can only play Barbies for so long, and then I'm bored, and I don't want to do that. It was the same with my own kids. I could only play for a certain amount of time, and then I had to do something else. I just did not have that tolerance. Now, let's say you're like me, and you want to be able to, have some quality time. There's no reason why you couldn't structure that time in a way and then provide reinforcers for yourself to make it happen more often. Now, I haven't had to do that yet. And my granddaughter is getting older, and as she becomes more communicative and she's developing different kinds of play, and that I think we're going to do all right. However, let's say you had to create a behavior plan for yourself because you want to spend more quality time with your kids or more quality time with your spouse. You want to do something that you're not necessarily, very into doing, but it's important to you for you to do it. Homework. A homework plan is great. Anything like that, you can describe that behavior, but then you got to take a real close look as what are you going to put on the line? What reinforcer? Like many of us probably don't have the means to gush money on ourselves because we're going to be able to do something like that. So oftentimes what we have to do is apply what's called the Premack principle, or it's sometimes referred to as the grandmother's principle. It's also very intuitive for things. So what we do is we look at what do we do when we're avoiding what we're supposed to be doing. When we are supposed to be on our exercise plan, what are we doing instead? So maybe we're watching TV. So maybe what you have to do is take TV time and make that contingent. ABC, contingency theory. Make television time contingent on successful completion of your plan. So you have a plan for studying. If I don't do that plan, I don't get TV. That's the only time the willpower has to kick in. Otherwise, every time you sit down to do your homework, let's say you can, in addition to getting the work done and learning and doing all that stuff, you can get through the tougher times by saying, I'm earning my television time. The only thing that's important that you have to keep in mind is that I can't get television otherwise, no matter what. You got to hold yourself to that. So if you're watching a series, you're going to miss it. Now, of course, we can record them, which makes it even more powerful tool. We can record the shows that we want to watch, and we can watch them right when we're done our homework. That could be the immediate reward for done. I'm going to watch, when I get this done, I'm going to watch an episode of one of my favorite shows. You can have them all lined up, and every time you earn one. Great, great way to build up habits of studying while also earning the joys of life, like watching television. So ultimately you would have a consequence at the end. Now the actual assignment itself is in detailed writing in the course book. Follow that, send some questions. I'm an expert at designing these kinds of plans, so please utilize my expertise to help you come up with ideas. Now, I don't want I don't know what to do. I can't help you there. You have to come to me with something already done. It's kind of ready to go. This is what I'm looking at. Here's what I've described the behavior. I'll poke holes in it, and stuff like that, get you going. The idea is that you're going to implement this plan. You're going to keep record of your success and failure. And at the end, in following with the rubric on the assignment itself, you're going to evaluate how effective the program was. Keeping in mind that your reinforcer might not be strong enough. Maybe you really thought you liked that show, but it wasn't enough to get you through homework. Maybe you need something even more powerful. And I've seen people put real things on the line. I put, the people who enjoy spending time with their kids, put that on the line. Wow. Get your homework, and that's how you get to spend time with your kids. And if you have a value system of spending time with your kids, you're going to get that homework done. I mean, it really does put it puts the screws to the thumbs, as they say, to make things happen if you really want to see that kind of change in your life. So here we have, 2 areas of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and of course the application of classical conditioning in advertising and the application of classical conditioning in behavior management or personal change projects like this one. So good luck with that. Take this stuff, run with it. It's very powerful for self-management. I am continually on a personal set of goals that are associated with rewards that I give myself. That's how people ask me sometimes how I get so many things done. And except for grading, apparently, I'm a little bit behind in that. But that's actually on the newly revised plan that I'm starting this week. Is I've added a grading expectation, a daily grading expectation, because I've been a little lax in that. So the plan morphs itself to meet the needs that I have at a particular time. So that's it for now. Enjoy all of this, and I will see you next time.